Just getting this new video from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a video of that raid of the elections office from a Fulton County police officer who was on site. The officer states several times he's not been given a copy of the warrant by the federal agents on scene. And at one point, the officer is speaking to the acting FBI special agent who says a warrant for a second location is in the works. Let's watch.
So we have the right to be here, and we've been very nice.
So did anybody get a physical copy of the search warrant?
No.
When did they get here?
About 12:30.
Just unannounced?
Unannounced.
I'm gonna try and have the names of everybody that was out here. I already know how it's gonna go, but I mean, if they refuse, that's on them. Thank you. All right, so we were given very limited information.
So we have a search warrant for this, like literally for the entire location.
Okay.
But now we're amending another search warrant for another location called the state. So we'll have that pretty soon. So
This is all in regards to election side stuff.
you know where we're here, right? So I can't discuss more.
I got you.
More than that, but as long as we keep, the big thing is just trying to keep media. Someone let media in here and keep media clear out of here.
What's happening now is that their warrant is wrong. It had the wrong, it's not in elections possession, it's in clerk's possession, so it had the wrong department.
So on our end, nobody received a copy of.
The attorneys asked them for it, they finally gave them a copy. Then the attorney's like, it's wrong, so they're allegedly waiting for the judge to update it.
What was wrong on there? It was
It didn't say, it just says, elections, which we don't have, in which they knew that before they got here.
The warrant will be amended slightly, but for all intents and purposes, what they had is what it's going to look like. We wanted to let her facilitate us moving through the building to unlock the gates so that we don't have to breach it, because one way or the other, the records are coming with us today.
Again, that video shot from a local police officer's body cam confronting some of these federal agents. James, what stood out to you in that footage?
The debate that they're having seems to be about process and details. I don't know that that'll end up being a huge factor in the overall scheme of things, but it may be a factor in give the Fulton County election officials a basis to challenge the seizure of the various voter materials, ballots, et cetera, down the road. That could be a basis for a lawsuit if, in fact, the government is seizing material that is either not properly specified or the location is not properly specified. It's a little unclear. I think the real questions here will be about who's driving this. I mean, think about, the DNI ends up being part of this search, and then the phone call. I was thinking about an analogy today. Imagine a scenario where you were at Mar-a-Lago and Jack Smith or Merrick Garland had called President Biden during the search for those documents. Imagine the outrage there. And that's essentially the equivalent of what we're talking about. And yet that never occurred, and it would have been outrageous had it occurred. This is being driven in a way that we talk on a regular basis, and maybe a broken record, but the line between the White House and the Department of Justice is no longer blurry. It's just gone.
And you have lawmakers who are supposed to be a check on the power of the president just going along with it when we're talking about the Republican Party specifically, which has the power in the House and the Senate right now. Ken, the FBI special agent in this video says they're also getting a search warrant for another location. As far as we know, that hasn't happened yet, right?
Yeah, that's right, Anna. And I think we need to sort of make a distinction between the conduct of the FBI agents we saw in that video and the overall outrage about what's going on here. They were very deferential, the FBI was, to those local officials. That warrant gave them the authority to break the locks and go in there and seize those ballots. They didn't do that. They tried to secure cooperation. But there's a couple of important things to keep in mind. One, the special agent in charge in Atlanta, we reported last week, was forced out of his job because he expressed qualms about and was not willing to go along with this search. So that's a data point. Another data point is that they convinced a magistrate judge that they had enough evidence to secure a warrant. And we don't know what that evidence was, but an independent judge signed off on this. So there is some credibility. There's something behind this search. But it doesn't mean that it has anything to do with the wild conspiracy theories that Donald Trump and Tulsi Gabbard are spinning.
So the Fulton County officer says they didn't receive a copy of the warrant. Ken, do local authorities usually get a copy of a search warrant when the feds carry out a search in their locality or jurisdiction? Is there typically at least some either coordination or at least some, respect given or shown in that way?
Yes, the target of the search is entitled to a copy of the warrant, and that video was edited, so I'm not sure what the context of that was. They didn't have a copy at that moment, or that particular officer didn't have a copy. I have no doubt that the FBI handed a copy of the warrant to somebody at that local office, and again, they were very deferential. I don't think you can criticize the conduct of the FBI from what we saw in that video, but again, that it really has no bearing on the concerns that James raised. He's absolutely right. The outrage that we would have heard from Republicans on the Hill, if anything like what happened here happened under the Biden administration, would have been deafening. The hypocrisy is astounding.
Let's talk more about how unusual this was in terms of who was involved. Getting back to Tulsi Gabbard, she was on site and now she just put out a letter to Congress. How is she justifying her involvement and an apparent phone call that she helped orchestrate between President Trump herself and some of these federal agents who took part in executing the search warrant?
Exactly. So it's Tulsi Gabbard's role that is drawing the most attention and concern here. She is saying that the president sent her there because as DNI, she has authority over election security, including counterintelligence and foreign malign influence issues. But that suggests that Donald Trump and Tulsi Gabbard are focusing on some of the most bizarre conspiracy theories around the 2020 election involving Italian satellites and foreign manipulation of voting machines, all of which were debunked by the very intelligence agencies that Tulsi Gabbard now leads. Remember, there were 3 separate recounts in Georgia. And remember that the top officials in the Trump administration, including Bill Barr, the Attorney General, rejected these wild conspiracy theories. And the idea that Tulsi Gabbard, put Donald Trump on the phone, as the New York Times is reporting, and spoke to those agents is just so out of bounds for the way the FBI normally operates. This isn't a case where there were FBI agents in danger overseas, grabbing up a fugitive. You could understand a president calling to congratulate them or talk to them. In that case, this was an investigation that Donald Trump has an intense interest in, a highly politicized and political investigation. And here he is right in the middle of it, underscoring for all to see that there is no independence between this Justice Department and this White House.
James, the fact Gabbard is confirming, we had this phone call as if it's just no big deal. I talked to the president. He talked to agents involved. He wanted to thank them for their work. How unprecedented, how strange, how dangerous is this?
I think Ken's points are so well taken. And I think that the key here is that we tend to start looking at each of these individual instances as one-offs. This is a strategy. Think about this as a step-by-step. Revive the 2020 election big lie, seize or demand voting records, float nationalizing the elections when, as Ken just noted, you are an interested party. You're on both sides of the transaction, as we've seen in the context where he sues the IRS and then decides how much he'll settle for. Push unilateral executive action until the courts step in. Make the equivalent of ransom demands that we've seen in Minnesota. We'll pull ICE out if you'll give us all of your private voter data.
Yep.
Chill election administration, threaten election officials, make them very, very scared, and head into 2026 with a system that is under stress and where public confidence is weakened. That is how democratic backsliding occurs.
Do you think it will lead to any voter disenfranchisement?
If some of the pieces of legislation that are being considered in Congress pass, then yes, the so-called SAVE Act. There's certainly a huge initiative. There's been an initiative over many years to increase the documentation and increase the rigor of documentation for voter registration. The data on this is incredibly clear. Non-citizens, statistically speaking, do not vote. There were 20 registered non-citizens in the state of Georgia, which has 8.2 million people. 9 of them voted, probably by mistake, but they may have a serious issue on their hands. The idea of disenfranchising millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people, in order to prevent those 9 is a cure in search of a problem.
Vaughn Gabbard said her presence was requested by the president. She also writes in her letter to lawmakers, "I've not seen the warrant or the evidence of probable cause that the DOJ submitted to court for approval." So back to why her? Why did President Trump send Gabbard and not someone actually involved in this investigation or more suited to this type of investigation?
Right. And I think, number one, Anna, that if you go back to October 7, 2016, it was the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. It was the same day that the Access Hollywood tape came out, and so kind of got blurred over in the month before the 2016 election. But it was the ODNI that put out that statement at the time that said the U.S. intelligence community was confident that the Russian government directed the recent compromises of emails from U.S. persons and institutions, including from U.S. political organizations. Of course, that was the hacking of the DNC in the Hillary Clinton emails. And the ODNI was involved because of concerns about the extent to which there were foreign actors that were intervening in U.S. elections. And the ODNI would work with state and local elections officials to ensure the protection and security of election systems, which gets to Ken's point, is the question here as to what is being suggested by this White House, the Department of Justice, as to the reason that they moved forward with the seizure of these ballots and the equipment in Fulton County here. We do not have all of those answers at this time, but Tulsi Gabbard saying even herself she does not know. But this goes back to a very an odd relationship, if you will. Of course, she endorsed him back in August of 2024 for president up in Michigan, ultimately named her to this important part in the cabinet. But then all the way back in June, she was the one who was suggesting that the U.S. intelligence community did not have information that suggested that Iran was actively building a nuclear weapon. Days later, President Trump, he said that she was wrong, disputing her own intelligence. So this is a moment ever since then where we have seen Tulsi Gabbard very much, at least publicly, walk in lockstep with the President of the United States.